Have you got big questions about God? Are you wrestling with doubts?
Welcome to Questioning Christianity,
We believe that truth invites questioning, and that faith is not a blind leap in the dark.
but a response to the light of God's revelation.
So whether it's God's hiddenness or history,
Science or scripture,
ethics or evidence,
purpose or pain.
we create content to take questioners and their questions seriously.
We talk with scholars for expert insights and lay out the reasons why Christianity is worth believing.
Questioning Christianity.
Connecting the Christian story to life's deepest questions.
Well, welcome, David Pallman, back to the channel here at Questioning Christianity. It's great to have you on to be able to discuss debunking the myths surrounding the Crusades. How have you been since last you were on?
I've been doing well. Thanks again for having me on. This topic's a bit of a passion of mine, so thanks for giving me an opportunity to talk about it. You know, have a creative outlet here.
Yeah, mate. I think I saw your bookshelf in the background in one of the photos that you posted on Here's My Readings in the Crusades over the years, as well as a little bit of memorabilia as well. Have you got your big Crusader helmet there?
Yep, I got it.
Let's give everyone a good shot of that.
There we go.
Check it out. That's serious. Great. So if anyone tries to break into your house, they may be met with a show of defense. I think this is a really important conversation to have, though, because when I was first becoming a Christian and then beginning to have conversations with friends and finding what are the big barriers that people have towards belief in God, certainly the history of the church is maybe one of the biggest stumbling blocks, is that people throughout Christian history just have not always looked all that Christian. And so people wonder, does the gospel really work? Is Christianity really true? If it's meant to change people to become more like Jesus, is a bad church good reason to reject the good news? And so the Crusades was often one of the major objections that particularly the new atheists would raise. That religion leads to violence. Just simply look back at the Crusades and all of these people claiming God wills it and running off full of greed and rapacious attitudes to go and do violence upon the Muslim population in the Middle East. And so I think it's just really important in the clear light of history to be honest about the good, the bad, and the ugly of this chapter in human history. And given your research interests and your upcoming video series that you're planning to do in the months to come on your own YouTube channel, which we'll post in the comments, by the way, it's just great to be able to have this conversation. So what we're going to do in this episode, for those who are watching, particularly if you're on live, you have an opportunity to ask questions now in the comments. Just preface them with Q, and we'll do those questions right throughout the episode. Big thanks too for those who give super chats to support the channel. It's just really gracious of you. Thanks for doing that. But we're going to be debunking a number of myths. We're going to do at least 5. Maybe there'll be some bonus ones if people are asking questions, but popularly believed myths when it comes to Crusader history. Do you want to give us a quick overview of those 5 so people know what's in store as to whether or not they want to watch to the end?
Yeah, we can do that. And maybe just a brief word about why this is worth talking about. Of course, you brought up one, is that this is frequently raised as an objection to Christianity. And it's typically just kind of thrown in there, right? With there's all these religious wars, right? And religion divides people. And the Crusades are just kind of, I guess, supposed to be the quintessential example of that, with really very little understanding most of the time regarding the complexities of the history here. But it's also sometimes just part of a broader attack on Western culture. And so there's sort of this question of, why are you sort of interested in addressing this issue, right? Like, you're not even Catholic, right? I'm a Protestant. So why do I care about addressing this issue, right? I get that, but it's because of the broader attack, I think, on sort of Western European culture that I'm motivated to say, kind of push back, I think, on some of these ideas, that sort of this narrative that the Crusades are being sort of uncritically used to prop up. And so, of course, with that comes a big mythos regarding the Crusades, you know, with respect to the sort of motivations and things that were going on. So some of the ones, of course, we'll be discussing today are going to be the idea, of course, that the Crusades were some of the sort of these unprovoked wars of European aggression against their sort of culturally superior Muslim neighbors who were just living there peacefully, doing their thing. Another one that's I've really pushed back against is the idea that the Crusades involved like converting people at sword point, right? This convert or die idea. It just has nothing to do with the Crusades, right? Another one is that the Crusaders were just motivated by greed, right? These were greedy second sons who weren't going to be inheriting anything from their parents, right? Because that was going to the older sons, so they decided to seek their fortunes in the east, right, and take the wealth that was there. Another one is going to be that the Crusades are the cause of the present conflict in the world, right, in the Middle East, that we're somehow to blame, as President Bill Clinton implied at one time after the events of 9/11, sort of implying that, well, you know, you
Christians started the fight.
Right. Yeah. You got some blame here, right? Because there's this long memory of these atrocities that you perpetrated, right? And so 9/11 was just payback for that. And then I think theologically, the idea that there was something just sort of fundamentally unchristian about this, and that Christians can't go to war ever, or that certainly they can't conduct warfare, perhaps in the way it was conducted at that time. So those will be some of the main myths that, of course, I'll be covering in my own video series coming up on this, and of course on the program today.
Yeah, awesome. Well, let's maybe jump into these one at a time then, and we'll pause out and get pretty detailed in some of the sources and key ideas that are involved along the way. Maybe just a heads up for those that are watching, if you just need a play-by-play of what the Crusades were, we'll do some of that quick recap history, talk about the geography and the timeline and when all of this was too, but we will dive a little bit deeper in trying to justify, I guess, the arguments, or in debunking these myths, actually make sure that there's some substance to the claims that David's making. Let him make his case based on the historical records that are there. And there's quite a bit in terms of where we draw our information from, whether it's Christian sources, firsthand eyewitness accounts, whether it's a later kind of historiographical work, whether it's Muslim sources, again, some that were there and that were present. There's quite a number of historical sources that go into us really trying to reconstruct what happened over the course of this really 200-year period, predominantly, that we're talking about, that's kind of earmarked around the period of the Crusades. So how about we dive in with that first myth that you spoke about, the idea, number one, that Crusades were unprovoked sort of proto-colonialist invasions of otherwise previously peaceful Muslim lands. The Christians just got all aggressive at one point in time and went to make war on the Muslims in the East. Help us think through this a little bit.
Yeah, so I think to properly understand the Crusades, because the Crusades are a reactionary movement against Islam, and to understand that, you kind of have to understand the history of Islam to some degree. So this begins with the Prophet Muhammad, who is kind of a warlord of the time, right? It doesn't start out that way, right? But once he sort of gains a foothold, well, after he gets tossed out of Mecca, goes to Medina, and he becomes kind of a warlord here. And one thing that's important, I think, for people to grasp is that Islam is inherently an imperialistic religion in a way that Christianity is not, right? Islam has this doctrine. It's actually part of the doctrines of Islam that they are one day going to like conquer the whole world, right? The whole world is going to acknowledge that there is no God but Allah. And that Muslims are supposed to participate in that through the practice of holy war called a jihad. Now, of course, that doesn't always have to be understood in a violent way, of course, and I understand that not all Muslims are jihadis, of course. But the point is that that idea of this struggle against the unbeliever, right, in the service of expanding Islam, that is built into the religion of Islam. In a way, it's just not in Christianity, right? Christianity is evangelistic.
Would still want to see everyone in the world become a Christian, but they do so by prayer and persuasion, not by force conversion or in any way using political pressure to try and bring that about. It has to be a voluntary desire of a free invitation that's offered. And I do think that's one of the key differences. And tomorrow, actually, on the channel, I'm going to have Dr. Doug Gruthais on to explore what is Islam's mission to the West. This is an area that his research that he's especially passionate about. But this idea that the Islamic world, the Ummah, will eventually incorporate the whole world, that Islam will be in every house. There are different tacks on how that should happen, but it's a core conviction of every true Muslim that that's what they want to see happen around the world. Sharia law instantiated everywhere, that the whole world comes under submission to Islam, which is just a very different end game than what Christianity would have.
Yes, because Christianity is evangelistic like Islam, but it's not imperialistic like Islam. And that's where I draw the distinction between the two. Of course, that's not to say that Christians have never been imperialistic, right? But the question is that something that they're just doing for other reasons, or is it actually born out of their religious ideology? And in fact, it's not, right? You don't have anything in the teachings of Jesus about spreading by the sword. You very much have that in the teaching of Muhammad, right? That you're supposed to fight the unbeliever and that you're supposed to smite off every head and fingertip until they confess that there is no God but Allah, right? Again, I realize not all Muslims understand this in the most violent sense possible, but it is built into the religion.
And it's interesting that they've got as their founding example, Muhammad, who literally went on dozens of war campaigns. So he is by nature a warlord who is the supreme example that all Muslims should be following.
Yeah, in fact, going through all the sources, there's a scholar named David Cook who added it all up, and we can verify 86 different military campaigns or raids that Muhammad either sanctioned or participated in. So Muhammad was a warlord, right? That's their example. You don't have that in the example of Jesus, right? He's the Prince of Peace. So this is one reason why Islam, sort of from its inception, is spread by the sword. And so this goes on for 400 years, right? And it might surprise a lot of viewers, in fact, to know that a lot of the Muslim world was Christian, right? You had this land was ruled, like the lands of the Middle East were part of the Roman Empire, and the Roman Empire under Constantine adopted Christianity. So Christianity was the state religion of the Roman Empire. And so these lands were largely Latin Christian until Islam came and turned these into Muslim lands. And that's not to say you didn't have Christians or Jews living there. Of course you did. But the state religion, if you will, was Islam. And so Islam spreads into Europe, right? It comes into Spain, it comes into Italy, it gets into France, right? You have Charles Martel, right? Charles the Hammer Martel has to throw it out of France at the Battle of Tours, right? So Islam was making a lot of headway into Christendom.
It's wild for people to actually consider the geography of how quick it spread. So, Muhammad dies in 632 or something like this AD. And then from there, within a generation, it spread right across North Africa. It spread up into Europe and through Turkey. And it's pushing hard very quickly in these military campaigns. And so you've got what were traditionally Christian lands in North Africa and throughout the Middle East and up into parts of Europe that now have been at the tip of the sword converted to Islam, where people are either forced to pay the jizya, the tax, to be able to retain their religious identity, or were moved on, dispossessed entirely of their land and possessions if they wouldn't convert to Islam. And so just getting your head around how quickly that happened just helps give you experience of maybe some of the struggles and terror then that was part of the, I guess, Christendom or the geographical areas dominated by Christian belief.
Correct. Yeah. And it really, because hard to think, we don't think of Spain as a Islamic nation, right? But at the time of the First Crusade, half of Spain was ruled by the Moors, right? Egypt, right? North Africa, as you mentioned, that's being ruled by the Fatimids. You have the Seljuk Turks, and they're making so remember the Roman Empire splits at one point, right? You have the Western Roman Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire. Now the Western Roman Empire dies, and that's what enters into what's called the Dark Ages. Historians have kind of debunked that it really was the Dark Ages. That's kind of a Renaissance Enlightenment era myth. It wasn't really the Dark Ages, but it's what's been come to be known as the Dark Ages, Middle Ages. But the Eastern Roman Empire survives until this point, right? Or it's also known as, at the time of the Crusades, it's known as the Byzantine Empire. So that's kind of the wall, right, between Christian Europe or Catholic Christian Europe, and you've got the Eastern Orthodox Byzantine Empire, and that's the wall between them and Islam. And the Byzantines were under heavy attack during that time, right? So Western Christianity wasn't directly feeling a lot of the pressure of Islam because that was on the Byzantine Empire. But you have the Battle of Manzikert happen in 1071, and that really breaks a lot of the military might of the Byzantine Empire. They lose a lot of land, and they lose a lot of prestige as well.
Mm.
So they want that.
Is that when they put the call for help out as well to the West?
Correct. So it's after this point that the Emperor Alexius, he calls to the Pope to ask, for some knights, kind of help me out, right? And of course, the Pope has some motivation to do that because, again, Byzantium is the wall between Europe, Christian Europe or Catholic Europe, and the Muslims. So if that wall falls down, then he has to directly deal with the Muslims. So the First Crusade starts as a call for help from the Byzantines to the Catholics, asking them for help. And so the idea that the Crusades are unprovoked, right? That this is just the Europeans decided to, up one day and go take over the Holy Land. It's complete mythology, right? It's a response to 400 years of Muslim aggression against Christian lands.
Which is just wild. Like if you look now, the USA has been an independent country since 1776 and the Declaration of Independence, or the winning of the war, wherever you want to kind of mark that. But like that's only 250 years old, right? Add another 150 years. That's how long you've been experiencing the slow disappearance of lands once thought to be dominated largely by Christian populations and churches that were either being overthrown, people being exiled, or being forcibly converted, and just enduring that for century upon century upon century without much of a response in any strong military way or any concerted campaign, but just to defend where you are at whatever kind of point the eastern and western parts of the empires were. But it's a long time to be facing constant military aggression.
Yeah, and this actually kind of bleeds into a sort of related myth, which is that the Muslims were incredibly tolerant, right, to the Christians that were conquered, that the Muslims were just very advanced and believed in religious freedom, and the Crusaders were like these barbarians converting at sword point. It's really closer to the opposite here. In fact, if you read accounts of Pope Urban's speech at Clermont, right, where he calls for the First Crusade, one of the major driving factors that he brings up for why the Christians should be going west to retake these lands is precisely that the Muslims just treated the Christians terribly, right? You mentioned that they, overtaxed them with the jizya, but there's a lot of evidence indicating that there were these like really terrible discriminatory policies against them, ranging from like they had to wear these like 4-pound stone crosses around their necks to like identify that they were Christians, that they weren't allowed to build any churches, that their churches could be burned down. The idea that the Muslims were just so tolerant to the Christians has no basis in history. This is actually one of the major driving forces for the First Crusade, is that the Muslims were just incredibly oppressive to the Christians that they were ruling over. And so one of the main incentives is to liberate these lands from Muslim rule, to liberate their Christian brothers and sisters. And so this might lead us into our next myth here, but that's the context for the First Crusade. It's a reactionary movement to the imperialistic aggressions of Islam.
So it wasn't the idea of, hey, let's just expand and take territory from otherwise peaceful people in some imperialist sense. It is in its core, I guess, motivated by a desire to liberate Christian brothers and sisters, and to, if anything, take back land that they felt had been stolen, and to be able to push back the advancing armies so that the still Christian lands weren't being threatened as well. There's always going to be in here a degree where you're going to have standout characters. And so whenever we say the Christians or the Crusaders, whenever we say the Muslims, it's too generalist to actually whitewash everyone with a particular behavioral system. And so whenever we're making general comments here, please, I don't want anyone to read, hey, there weren't Muslims of great character who may have also stood out in leadership positions, or there weren't Christians of bad character who did evil. And we're going to be exploring some of that, the good, the bad, and the ugly. But it's just important to clarify in these general senses, wait, what were the pretty typical behaviors and experiences that people were undergoing, for us to be able to get a proper sense, okay, why does Pope Urban, why do we get this great call to be able to go and to make this step? It might be helpful here for people to be able to see just a bit of a picture of what the I guess, Crusades largely look like, just to get a sense of some of the territory. Do you just want to talk through this a little bit? Because even just getting a sense of when we're talking about, from sort of 1096 with the launch of the first crusade all the way through to into the 1200s or 13th century. Just want to talk through this graphic a little bit to give people some insight.
Yeah, and it's, it says like England, France, Holy Roman Empire, Hungary, right? At the time of the First Crusade, especially, these aren't even really like firmly established nations either, right? We're dealing with more like loose confederations.
Yeah.
We don't really have the European like monarchy as we know it, right? So it's very hard to get everybody together and unified on these sort of big ventures, just because of how sort of fragmented Europe is at this time. I would also,
Yeah.
at the time of the First Crusade, the Islamic territory is actually probably quite a bit bigger.
Yeah.
Than what you're seeing here. This is obviously, they're doing the best they can to give you the sort of routes for all of the different crusades. But it's good to see a bit of the sort of size of Islam at this point, right? And this is just over 400 years that they'd spread like crazy. It's actually incredible that it took that long for them to get the sort of backlash that they had in the Crusades. And this is another point that I've made. I don't think it's primarily motivated by Christianity. I think you'd have something like the Crusades happen without Christianity. Like even if like, let's say Christianity had just died out, in the first century or something like that, they would have had a different shape to them. They probably wouldn't have been called the Crusades. The history, of course, would have played out somewhat differently, but you were going to get a backlash from the West at some point. In fact, it could be the restraining effects of Christianity that actually, it could be part
held
of the
it for so long.
it took 400 years for that backlash to finally come.
Yeah. And it is interesting too, just to see how thoroughly Christianity actually seeped into the bones and the teaching of Christ into people's understanding at that period in time. Like, you understand literacy rates, you understand access to scriptures in people's own native tongue, whether they understood the teachings of Jesus individually, just how much of that people really had the ability to even test how thoroughly Christian was the culture, or was the culture of the Middle Ages and the Crusaders baptized in versions of Christian belief that were always a bit of a mixed bag. And that's part of the challenge of every era, is that you've got multiple things going on, layers in people. There's the cultural beliefs that are there. There's the Christian story and the way it shapes or is understood by that culture at the time. And so there's all, I guess, complicating factors that are part of it too. All right, but do you want to walk us through then the second myth, this idea that the Crusades involved forcibly converting people to Christianity? And you kind of hear this a fair bit, what's different between those who would be maybe Islamic extremists who are putting a knife to people's throats and forcing them to convert to Islam or else lose their life. Isn't that exactly what Christians were doing at different points in history too, when they had the cultural power? How do you respond to that myth?
Yeah, and let's not, pretend there's never been any examples of Christians going out there and converting people at sword point, right? I think that there's some decent reasons to believe that some of the Carolingian kings are probably doing that during the Middle Ages. So it's not to say that Christians have never done that, but that is not what the Crusades were about. Certainly not initially, right? These are very much a response to a call for aid from the Byzantines. The idea is that we're going to liberate the Christian lands, we're going to liberate our Christian brothers and sisters, and we're going to take back the city of Jerusalem. There's no idea here of converting Muslims at sword point. It's not there. You might be able to find like one isolated case during the siege of Antioch on the First Crusade where something like that might have happened, but it's very much an exception to the rule. When you start getting a conversionary aspect added to the Crusades is going to be an event called the Wendish Crusade, which happens actually in northeastern Europe. It was kind of an extension of the Second Crusade. And that was sort of being used as a justification for some of the kings of Europe to go to war against the pagan Wends. And so it was like, well, we'll convert them to Christianity. Of course, later on in the Northern Crusades, you have a similar idea with the Teutonic Knights going to war against the Baltic peoples. And the Northern Crusades, of course, are a big issue in and of themselves. The interesting thing, though, is that they're virtually they're unknown to most people. So that cannot be what most people are talking about when they're saying that conversion at sword point happened. And that's also really a misunderstanding of what's going on in the Northern Crusades as well. It's not like the Teutonic Knights are like bursting into Lithuanians' homes, right? And like putting a sword to their throat and saying, convert or die. What they meant, according to canon law, when they were converting people, warfare was seen as an indirect means of doing this, right? So it was that if we send missionaries into these pagan lands, they're going to kill the missionaries. So we're going to send knights there, right? Crusader knights to protect them. So it's not the knights aren't doing the converting. In other words, they are making it possible for the missionaries to do their missionary work. That is what they meant. That's not to say that always played out perfectly, right? You know, when we're dealing with messy human endeavors, messy human stuff happens. But theoretically, that was the idea in the Northern Crusades. We're going to be converting these people, but military is an indirect means of doing that. It's just going to let the missionaries do their job.
Yeah. Where do you think that narrative comes from then? The idea that the Crusaders went across and everywhere they get, they're essentially trying to convert people by the tip of the sword. Is that just post-Enlightenment mythology that's been laced on this? Is this 18th, 19th century myth? Like, where do you think this storyline comes from?
Some of it does come from there, and a lot of it does come from perhaps more careful critics of the Crusades applying this criticism to the Northern Crusades, although for the reasons I just explained, I think it's a misapplied there as well. But some of it comes from trying to apply it to the Northern Crusades and then that just getting missed by people, that there's actually a huge distinction between how the Crusades were carried out in the Holy Land versus Spain versus in Northeastern Europe versus, you know, in France. And so I think a lot of it just comes from a miscommunication there, people thinking, oh, well, that's what all of it was about. And then some of it is just I think comes from a desire to do tu quoque, right? Say that, oh, well, you know, you did it too, right? Because look, religious wars. If you had Christians fighting Muslims, it had to be because they had different beliefs, right? And so the idea was to get them to hold our beliefs. And of course, that simply is misunderstanding the wars, certainly as they were carried out in the Holy Land.
How do you understand then the teaching of Jesus and the apostles and the nature of Christian belief acting as a bulwark against this kind of Christian behavior? Because I guess whenever people raise the Crusades as an objection to Christianity, I'm like, you have a very Christian objection to the Crusades for the most part, because your concerns are a respect for human life. Your concerns are a love even for our enemies. Your concerns are, wait a second, should we be using the sword in order to bring about the future kingdom of God? Is that the right means to bring about God's ends? Can we use the world's weapons for the Lord's battles? All of these sorts of questions. I'm like, well, you seem to be using very Christian critiques of Christianity. What's your approach for maybe responding to these concerns when someone says, well, Christians were using swords to kill or convert Muslims? Look, that's just entirely, a terrible thing. How do you respond maybe more of the apologetic side?
Yeah, so one aspect I think is to hammer home that they're actually they're not using swords to convert people, right? At least not in the convert or die sense. When they are using them, they're using them in, very standard, geopolitical reasons that we would engage in warfare today. Now, I don't necessarily like couching them in terms of the Christian faith, right? Because I think that wars are generally things that nations or groups of people engage in against other groups of people. They're not things that religions should be engaging in against other religions. So it is unfortunate that the Crusades were framed in that way. That was a convenient way to find a sort of way to unite the people of Europe, right? Again, Europe is fragmented, right? This is something that they had in common. It was something where you had a common leader, right? The Pope. That was just the easiest way to unite the Westerners to go east. But as far as should, killing ever take place, this I think is going to, of course, get us into perhaps something we'll discuss more later, which is going to be
we'll pick up on,
right?
Correct. We'll pick that up on maybe the fifth myth, but I definitely think you're touching on something which is the real challenge here. Is it does seem to be framed as the church or Christianity versus Islam, as opposed to what Christians would often consider be government forces and their responsibility to restrain evil and promote the good, and to be gifted with the right of the sword to that end as an institutional authority by God. So we'll maybe come back to that a little bit. But I know for me personally, like I'm thinking about when people raise the Crusades or any unchristian behavior, you might say the concern would be whether it's plundering or raping or pillaging, which is some of the other content we need to get to. You're largely using a Christian conscience and objective moral vision to critique Christianity, and I'm like, that's the whole point. The problem, if you do have concerns with certain behaviors, was probably not that they were being Christian, but that they weren't quite being Christian enough. And we'll obviously need to parse out those things as they relate to just war theory and the responsibility, but we'll do that as we come. How about this third myth then? The Crusaders were motivated by greed. Is this the second sons going and making a name for themselves, becoming barons and inheriting lands and taking over titles? How should we understand this sort of myth?
Yeah, this was just this is taken for granted by a lot of people. And this was kind of just standardly assumed, say 100 years ago. And, before that time, going back to the Enlightenment and the Reformation, it was assumed, well, because basically the question is, right, when Pope Urban gave this sermon at Claremont, Europe, like Christian Europe, went on fire, right? It was something that was unprecedented, that you had all of these people who were all of a sudden willing to march east. And right, remember the call for help from Alexius. He just wanted like a group of elite knights that he could deploy to recapture his lands, right? He was not asking for, tens of thousands, right? If not hundreds of thousands of Westerners to come down there. He didn't even know what to do with them when they got there. He was like, this wasn't what I asked for. What on earth is this invasion, right, of Constantinople that's coming here? So an explanation had to be found for, like, what is it that motivated this, like, electrifying movement? And so it was just assumed that, oh, well, they knew that there was a bunch of money in the Middle East, so they wanted the money. Simple as that, right? The problem that modern historians have found with this over the past 50 to 100 years is that crusading, it turns out, was really, really, really expensive, right? We know a lot of, like, rich barons bankrupted themselves. They had to raise about like 4 to 5 times their annual income to go on crusade. It was so expensive that the Pope actually had to ask, like, richer members or just richer nobles in Europe to sponsor the poorer members of the crusade. It was just that expensive to travel, on foot from Europe all the way down to Jerusalem. And we can get a little insight of the Crusaders' motivations actually in the land transactions, right? From when they were selling off their lands. These actually have been preserved better than a lot of medieval documents. And a lot of historians in times past haven't actually paid attention. But Jonathan Riley Smith is a historian of the Crusades. He published a book a few decades ago called The First Crusade and the Idea of Crusading. He brought that evidence to sort of bear on the issue. And of course, it's proliferated since then. But what the Crusaders tell us about their own motivations is this is born out of a genuine concern for their Christian brothers and sisters living in the East, or that they just believe that this is something God really wants them to do. We don't get any hint that they're doing this just because they want the money. And in fact, we know that the Crusades turned out to be notoriously bad for kind of getting war booty. Like, you weren't able to get all that much plunder, certainly not enough to really cover your expenses. You have isolated cases here and there where it happened, but most of the time when the Crusaders returned home, they came back with nothing. They were destitute.
Really impoverished.
Their lands here, yeah. So it was a very impoverishing thing to go on crusade. And it was very much seen as an act of love for your Christian brothers and sisters. And, sometimes it was quite hard to try to get people to go on it, because it was like, well, why do I want to spend all the money to go east, right? I'm doing just fine here in Europe. In fact, that's kind of ultimately why the Crusader states failed. It was just a lack of manpower, because people were busy pursuing their own interests in Europe. So the idea that the Crusaders were motivated because they just wanted the money, it doesn't hold up, and that's been largely dispelled by
you don't see it in the testimonial evidence, and nor is it borne out by the actual effects at the end. There's no large kitty or pot or even lands that were going to be held and titled from there. Most of them end up going home rather than sticking around in the Holy Land. I think one of the other elements of this too is in levels of motivation. I mean, it's not just a desire to liberate Christian brothers and sisters, which is what you do see in the sort of explicit firsthand testimony that's given. And that's a beautiful desire, if nothing else, to help. Like you look around the world today and you see what's happening in parts of Africa or what's happening in parts of the Middle East. Remember when the 21 Christians were dragged out onto the shores of the Mediterranean and executed by Islamic militants, and we just watch on in horror and think, man, how can we not want to intervene? You think of when Boko Haram kidnapped 276 Nigerian schoolgirls, and Michelle Obama is up there holding a sign, get our girls, bring our girls home, bring them home. There's obviously this deep desire in us to want to liberate those who are being brutally oppressed or are facing death or the kind of conditions that would just be really ugly. We've seen plenty of examples of the way that we respond to that, even just recently. But there's also this other spiritual overlay. And this is part of maybe where it gets a little bit messy with the Pope's speech at Clermont, where you're offering not just a justification of, hey, here, these are our Christian brothers and sisters in the East, our Greek-speaking family, the Orthodox, the Byzantines, but there is an element here where you can actually earn spiritual penance or do spiritual penance as part of this as well. That because it's going to be so costly, here's one additional spiritual motivation you might want to take part in this. Do you want to speak to that?
We should bring this up, yes, because one of the incentives that Pope Urban added to this crusade, and of course to ultimately all the others, was that if you were successful on crusade, or if you died on crusade, then you'd be remitted all penance for your sins. So essentially, it's a straight ticket.
Skip purgatory.
Yeah, it's a one-way ticket to heaven, essentially. Of course, I do not agree with that, right? I think he was straight up lying, right? I'm not a Catholic. Obviously, my Christian or my Catholic friends will have disagreements with me on that. I have no doubt. But so what do we do with that? As I said, I of course have real theological problems with that, because I think it was giving people a false incentive. On the other hand, what I do think and I should say the backdrop to this is that a lot of people sort of assume that everyone in the past kind of thought the way that we do, right? So in our sort of modern, very metropolitan, very like corporate society, it's got to be monetary motivations. That is just not how medieval people thought. The Catholic faith permeates everything in medieval Europe. And there's this real consciousness of sin, right? Especially if you're a knight, right, who's going out there and, killing people quite often. There's this real fear that you're going to go to hell because of that, right? And that you have to do penance for your sins. So this is one way that the Pope is able to sort of motivate the knights of Western Europe to go on crusade, right? By telling them that they'll get the one-way ticket to heaven. Now, of course, I do think he's wrong about that. But what I think this does highlight is that the Crusaders themselves have, for the most part, genuinely religious, faith-based motivations for going on crusade. So it does highlight my argument, right? Which is that the motivation for going on crusade is not about the money, primarily. It's not about getting the wealth of the Near East. It's based in, genuine faith-based motivations. So while I do disagree with that, and I think that obviously it was wrong of the Pope to say that, he was leading people on, it does highlight that they aren't motivated primarily by the money here.
Yeah. And I think that's important, is that there's a sense this is going to be costly, that he needs to be offering the kind of justification of skipping purgatory, of being able to remit the kind of penance consequences of your sin, to be able to even do that for the sake of others. You could do that in the stand of others. Like that's quite a potent motivator because you realize this isn't going to be easy. This is going to be a very costly, dangerous endeavor for you to make. So to be able to try and encourage both through love and reward, 2 levels of motivation. I don't know whether he incorporated the fear too. If we don't do this, then they're going to be knocking at the gates. But at least 2 out of the 3 major kind of carrot and the stick levels of motivation are both kind of put in there at the same time. Well, let's jump to the next one and explore then this 4th idea, 4th so-called myth of the Crusades, that the Crusades were the cause of 9/11 and the present conflicts in the Middle East. How do you think this historical set of events actually relates to the kind of tensions we see between the West and the Middle East today?
Practically not at all. And this is actually quite interesting. This idea that the Crusades left this long memory on the Muslims, and that sort of some of the troubles that the West has with them today can be traced back to this. In the first place, as I already pointed out, right, the conflicts between the West and Islam go back way before the Crusades, right? The Crusades were a new chapter in that conflict, but they're certainly not the first chapter in that conflict. That's not the beginning of the conflict. The other thing is, Muslims basically forgot about the Crusades as soon as the Kingdom of Acre fell in 1291. The Muslims did not care about the Crusades. In fact, they didn't even really think of these as the Crusades, right? They initially just thought of this as this is a Byzantine mercenary army, we've dealt with that before. They don't really, in fact, even in Europe, the word crusade it's a pretty new invention. They were not actually calling them crusades at that time. So yeah, after Acre falls in 1291, the Muslims basically forget that the Crusades happened. We don't see it talked about in Muslim literature at all until relatively recently. And what has been talked about in recent times is a regurgitation of a lot of these myths that we've been talking about. So to whatever extent the Crusades have any relation to events today, it actually is not based on the actual events themselves. It's been based on a propagandistic sort of spinning of the Crusades. It's sort of it's a false memory of the Crusades, if I can put it that way, that is being used again in a propagandistic way to sort of motivate certain jihadists or people like that to commit retaliatory, scare quotes, retaliatory acts of violence against the West. It's not actually based on a long memory of the Crusades, and that again can just be demonstrated by looking at the paper trail.
Yeah, well, let's maybe do that in a second, because I think that they're sort of important claims to try and justify with the sources, and that might be useful for people. But just before we do that, I think this is maybe another instance, if that is true, of just how we're seeing how narrative can reshape history. And we're certainly seeing that happen here in Australia with some of the history between the Western settlers and then the Indigenous folks that were here, so First Nations people in Australia. Some of that original retelling has just look, there's messy things that happen, but there are entire narratives that have been put over this, like the claim, for instance, that under certain parts of state and local law that Aboriginal populations were treated not as human beings but actually as local flora and fauna, considered to be subhuman in that way. That was a myth I was taught in school that was just not true historically. And our broadcasting organization, our state-sponsored one, the ABC here in Australia, has just done a big expose on it. It's just a historical myth that somehow became mainstream, but just isn't true. Or the whole conflict hypothesis between science and Christianity, which you just kind of imbibe as part of Western civilization, and then you realize, well, this is an invention of a couple of guys in the 19th century who were just extraordinarily good at weaving a story and then having that go mainstream and being able to sell that story, and just kind of becomes part of the popular consciousness. And this is happening all over the place, where narratives, I guess, get spun, get believed, and then that interprets how everyone thinks about these sorts of events. So it's sort of another example. If these are genuinely myths that we are debunking as opposed to just claims. But that's, I guess, the important point now for you is, so you said there's a paper trail that says, look, Muslims didn't think much about this as being a key psychological scar or a deep wound of a war between the West and the Muslim world until more recently. And even the idea of crusades, that language being more of a European overglaze much more recently than what was understood back there, help fill in some of that history and sources, because there has been something of a revolution in the scholarship on this point over the last century or so. And it's maybe helpful to give people some recommendations on where they can read about this to test the sources for themselves.
Yeah, so there's going to be two really important books to read here. The first one is going to be called Arab Historians of the Crusades. I forget the author's name. I know it's an Italian name, but it's a translation essentially of all the relevant Arab sources into English.
Sure.
And what's very interesting about these authors is their priorities when they mention the stuff about the Crusades. That's not typically the focus of their narratives. In fact, they're typically, the Muslims are a lot more focused on fighting each other, right? This is one of the big reasons that the First Crusade was so successful, and that the Crusaders were actually successful up until the time of Saladin, is that the Muslims were so like disunited. They were all fighting with each other. And so when the Muslims talk about the Crusaders, or they call them all the Franks, regardless of, you know, whether they were actually Franks or Normans or Germans or whatever, they just called them all the Franks.
Yeah.
They're kind of like mentioned in passing, or like, here's an episode or something like that. It's not like, oh my gosh, you know, we're having this huge Western invasion on us. They're just kind of seen as like this another player there, like in the you know, board game going on of all these different Muslim factions, the Byzantine factions. Oh, and you have the Franks too. And so, of course, they talk about the interactions with the Franks, or the Crusaders, I'll just say. But that's not really the focus, right? And there's a really interesting admission on this. It's a book called The Crusades Through Arab Eyes by, I think his name is Amin Malouf. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. But the book was published in, I think, 1983. And he was sort of trying to present this modern idea, right, that the Crusades are sort of this long memory. But he kind of admits in the beginning that the sources on this are very patchy. Like, it's hard. It was like hard to actually get to the conclusion that he wanted to get to, even though he gets to it anyway, because the evidence is so scant. So it's interesting. Even the defenders of this narrative have a hard time actually finding anything that would back
the
it up.
source material to back it.
Precisely. So if you actually check the primary sources, talking about the Crusaders, it just drops after 1291. Like, the Arabs don't care. They don't give a rip about the Crusaders until much later on, when it becomes more politically advantageous for them to sort of spin this propaganda about like, oh, well, look what they did to us, so now we're justified in striking back, regardless of whether that, you know, even has any relevance. But the point is, it's not remembered till very, very recently. And I would also refer people to some of Thomas Madden's work on this as well. He has a couple interesting papers where he sort of traces the history of this in a lot more detail.
So the word Crusades, do you think that carries the kind of psychological scar for the Islamic world, for the Ummah, that we in the West think that it does? Because we've often been guilty of maybe feeling more for a particular sort of event or people group on their behalf than what is actually expressed or as a concern from them on the ground. So it'd be interesting to kind of get your take on that.
Yeah, actually, if you want a whole book on the word, like a word study of the word crusade, Christopher Tyerman has an interesting book called The Invention of Crusading, where he sort of traces the evolution of the word crusade. I don't think it appears until the 1600s is when we have the first actual use of that word, which is, you know, well after the Crusades.
Yeah.
And obviously,
what would you have said as you read the material across the different Crusades? What would they have called themselves?
Well, they generally refer to themselves as whatever
Knights, I
like
guess.
ethnic group that they're a part of,
Yeah.
right? So, you know, as the Germans, as the Franks, as the Normans, things like that. Sometimes they'll just be like one of our number, things like that. But they certainly don't refer to themselves by the term Crusader, unless you're reading a very like strange modern translation. But they would not, like, if you go to the original language, they're not going to be using any cognate of that word, because again, it didn't exist back then. As far as whether we're stirring something up if we use that term, perhaps so. Like, I believe George Bush, like, unfortunately referred to the Iraq War as a crusade at one point. That could have, but to whatever extent it did, again, it's going to be based on that false memory of the crusade.
Mm.
So it's more going to be based on this idea that the cultural idea that many Muslims have of the Crusades, which again is not even all that accurate to what actually happened. But that's a recent phenomenon that's being invoked there, as opposed to actually invoking anything about the events themselves.
Mm. Well, let's chat then about the last one, because this is probably going to be the biggest one with a lot of ground to cover in terms of number 5. The Crusades were fundamentally un-Christian, because this is going to bring up the question around whether violence in response to violent aggression is ever a Christian option. Is just war theory, is sort of heavily developed by Augustine, legitimate as something that Christians can engage into? And you've already brought up the distinction between religious engagement and then maybe secular or governmental power engagement. Maybe it'd be preferable that armies and nations went to war rather than the church, but we'll kind of talk about that too. But particularly, and I'd like to start with this first, some of the accounts that are particularly brutal. So even if you arrived at the idea, I do think there is a legitimate role for warfare. There are just wars that can be justified. There is still the kind of just practice in war. It's not just a just reason to go to war. It's a just means of prosecuting that war towards a just end. What do you actually think is the legitimate outcome that might make it worthwhile engaging in the first place? But there are accounts of particular kinds of atrocities or heinous acts that some of the Crusader groups perpetrated, first in their move across Europe and then down into particularly thinking the siege of Jerusalem, where you have accounts of the massacre at the siege of Jerusalem that takes place sort of up towards the Temple Mount, where the Dome of the Rock now stands. Help us think a little bit about some of these accounts of the atrocities, how you process that. Do you think this is honest historical reportage? How do you process, I guess, these atrocities?
Yeah, let's talk about some of them. So one that gets brought up a lot is going to be the Rhineland massacre of the Jews, right? So this happens sort of as the First Crusade is mobilizing. You have a group of Germans who are planning to go to the Holy Land on crusade, but sort of as they're going to the southern parts of Germany, right, or as they get to the Rhineland, there are Jews living there, and they were, I guess, deemed to be close enough to Saracens for these crusaders, and they started killing essentially the Jewish populations in the Rhineland and in other parts of southern Germany. And obviously, I'm not going to try to defend these guys, right? I think that what they were doing was wrong. Importantly, though, this is not part of the Crusades, or at least certainly it's not part of the intended purpose of the Crusades. This is kind of a rogue faction doing something that was not in any way part of the sort of scope of the First Crusade. It's explicitly condemned by the Pope himself. He condemned the violence. It's also often overlooked that the bishops in these towns where the violence occurred typically tried to actually protect the Jews from that by, in one case, sort of bringing them inside of the church and then locking the doors. Unfortunately, the Crusaders sort of battered their way in and slaughtered the Jews anyway. So obviously this is something that's indefensible. A question remains, of course, regarding there's a question of whether these people are really Crusaders at all, because they never got past Hungary, right? They never even joined the First Crusade. They never went into the Holy Land. They never actually even fought the Muslims. So they didn't make good on their crusading vows. So there's a legitimate question about whether they even should be qualified as Crusaders. But wherever you land on that, I think the central point is that was never supposed to be a goal of the Crusades, right? That was something that this rogue faction of Crusaders did. It was obviously wrong. But again, in warfare, unfortunately, you do have these rogue factions who will do these sorts of things from time to time. I think perhaps another one that would get brought up would be the violent way in which the Crusaders took over the city of Antioch when they did. And we have accounts there, very brutally, indiscriminately killing the population of Antioch. I think it's important to understand here that this is how medieval warfare was conducted, right? One of the incentives for surrendering during a siege was that if you didn't surrender and the besieging army had to break their way in, there had to be a credible threat there that they were really going to, ransack the city. That's not to say it made that right or anything. I'm not saying that that's obviously how warfare should be done, but we're in a pre-Geneva
They
Convention
were
age here.
caught up in the same conventions of what was happening culturally around them.
And yeah, and again, that was part of the incentive to try to get people to surrender. Is that if you don't surrender, then we're just going to let the soldiers do whatever they want to your city. Another point that often gets overlooked here, even by a lot of historians of the Crusades, is that I think in some ways you could say that the people of Antioch kind of provoked this sort of reaction from the Crusaders, right? We have like accounts that they took the Eastern Orthodox bishop who was in Antioch, and they would like hang him upside down outside of the walls while they were like being besieged, sort of in view of the Crusaders, and they would like be like beating his feet and like torturing him in various ways. If they captured Crusaders during the siege, they would do similar things to them as well. So that's not to justify it, but it is in some way to make it a little more understandable. It's not like they didn't do anything to provoke a very strong reaction from the Crusaders in this specific context. So that's not to justify a lot of the violent acts that went there, but it is to say, one, they're not particularly uncommon for medieval warfare. That was just kind of the deal in medieval siege warfare. If you don't surrender, you're going to get ransacked. And then also that the people of Antioch, the Muslim population, I think did do some things to sort of invite that sort of reaction from the Crusaders.
Sure. Yeah, I guess I'm just hearing your claim around this isn't a justification in any way, just trying to put yourself back in the headspace of where these people were in terms of warfare and cultural development. And even today, with all of our moral resources, you still have some soldiers go AWOL and do horrendous things. And I think the key account is, what is the reaction to that from those in authority? Are they justifying it? Are they sweeping under the rug, or are they calling it out and holding it to account? And it's interesting that you don't see those groups continue on then to, like you said, with the ones in southern Germany, to be able to then continue on and actually participate in the Crusades. And you wonder if that wasn't in small part they're just using the Crusades as a cover to go and do other things that they want to do, or were then pushed back and said, you know what, you're not coming with us. That's not on sort of where we are. How about the Siege of Jerusalem? I remember watching a documentary here in Australia for sort of public Christian organization, the Public Christianity Center for Public Christianity, did a documentary back in 2017 called "For the Love of God: How the Church is Better or Worse Than You Ever Imagined." And I thoroughly recommend the series. It's a movie length documentary, or you can do it in 4 1-hour episodes, a longer version, and they go through glimpses right throughout Christian history of some of the most beautiful scenes and the legacy that Jesus and his church have left as an imprint on Western civilization and elsewhere. But then they also expose some of the darker scenes, and there is a retelling of the Siege of Jerusalem, where the Crusaders break through the walls and then travel up to effectively the Temple Mount, where women and children and non-combatants had kind of gathered for safety, and then they slaughtered them. And the particular language is pretty awful, like the idea that the rivers of blood basically come up right into their clothes. They're wading through blood, and then they go down for a Thanksgiving service at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre straight afterwards. That just seems like such cognitive dissonance to us in the civilization that we live in today, of how could you perpetrate such evils upon a relatively innocent civilian population and then go to church straight afterwards to give thanks for victory. How do you make sense of that particular account?
Yeah, so the Siege of Jerusalem is obviously one of the more criticized aspects of the First Crusade. And again, I don't want to deny that any atrocities happened here. This is probably going back to the point of this being part and parcel of the medieval siege warfare, that there was kind of this deal of, if you surrender, you'll be shown lenience. If you don't surrender and we have to force our way in, then, we're going to pour out our wrath on you. Again, not to justify that, but that is very normal for siege warfare. Another thing I think, though, I would point out here is, again, not to deny that any atrocities happened, of course, because I'm sure many did. But the specific language that the accounts use here speak of like blood running up to a horse's bridle. And I think we have 4 different accounts that use something very similar to that. And I mean, if you just try to imagine that that was actually like that was literally true, I mean, it's almost comical, right? Or almost like it's almost absurd to think that there was that amount of blood all in one area. And the language is very similar to certain language that is used in the Book of Revelation. And
I was
so,
about to say, it sounds like apocalyptic language, right?
yeah, and I have the specific reference written down somewhere. I want to say it's Revelation 14:8, but I could be wrong, so don't quote me on that. But we have this very similar language where this is being used to speak of the judgment of God, right? And I think that the Crusaders are very self-consciously using this language, like to directly allude to that they believe what they're doing is the judgment of God. And so they're using this very exaggerated sort of language. A lot of scholars, again, Thomas Madden would be an example of a scholar who has defended this in rigorous detail. And another point to note here is if you take some of the figures literally of like how many people they say were slaughtered here, the estimates like are just vastly larger than like the entire population of Jerusalem could have even been at that particular time. And there's varying like vast discrepancies, I should say, between the sources, including the Muslim sources, as to how many people were actually slaughtered there.
Sure.
We have like estimates ranging from like hundreds of thousands to 3,000. So I guess the point there to say is it's not actually completely clear what the scale of the slaughter was. Undeniably, a lot of people were slaughtered. So I don't want to deny that or minimize that or soften that fact. And so I'm not trying to defend any of that, but just to give us an accurate understanding of the history. Probably if you're reading a lot of these medieval accounts literally, you're coming away with a picture that's exaggerated of what actually happened there. So that's in broad strokes what I would say about the siege of Jerusalem in 1099.
Yeah, it's helpful. Question here from Riley Young. It's a bit sidelined from what we're talking about exactly, but is it true that more slaves were taken from Europe by the Barbary pirates than slaves taken from Africa to America? I don't think so. I think from my memory, it was like a factor of 10 to 1 were a part of the transatlantic slave trade than the Barbary pirates. It's still over 1 million that were taken in that period of Barbary piracy. So it's still a large number, but I think it's like 11 or 12 million or something like that were taken from Africa over as part of the transatlantic slave population. So no, I don't think that's true. I think that's false. But slavery everywhere is bad. Is sort of where my position would be on that one. Do you have anything to add on that one? I don't know if you know anything more about that, David.
I haven't run the numbers on this in that kind of era of history, which is interesting, by the way. The war that Thomas Jefferson fought against the Barbary Coast pirates. But intuitively, that sounds wrong to me. I don't think the Barbary Coast pirates were obviously like a thorn in our side, obviously enough for Thomas Jefferson to send the Navy after them. But I doubt what they were doing was on the scale.
Would have the scale, correct, to be able to pull that off.
The Americas. I'd be very skeptical of that claim without seeing some serious support for it.
Yeah. I think this is maybe part of, though, the broad concern around a question like this. It is, what is the moral vision that Christianity ends up promoting is in the civilization? Is it one of bloodthirsty violence and preying upon others and using your power in a greedy push of colonialism? Is that the end game of the kind of world that Christianity is designed to produce? And I just, in the same way that I would see the Christian story as a profoundly messy story from Genesis 3 to Revelation 20, right? There's these beautiful bookends of Genesis 1 to 2 and Revelation 21 to 22, where God's will is done on earth as in heaven. But the rest of the book from Genesis 3 all the way to Revelation 20 is in a fallen, broken world where God is seeking to move the human project forward towards his final redemptive vision. And that there are these steps of developing moral understanding and virtue formation and giving wisdom that allow culture to develop to the point where it does reject certain practices that were part of the story or even necessary before, to be able to look back on those and leave them behind. And so my work on slavery, if you're interested in the channel, does the Bible promote slavery? We kind of try and walk that out. How do we understand the redemptive movement hermeneutic? Someone like William Webb in what is it? Bloody, Brutal, and Barbaric. I think his text on sort of those Old Testament, the Torah's take on slavery and then sort of violence as you see within the Canaanite conquest and stuff like that, would be helpful to check out on that.
Yeah. I also find it helpful to distinguish between Christianity and nominal Christians, right? Because it's a lot of times I'll see people make the claim that like, oh, well, look, Christianity has brought so much violence. And when you oppress people on these claims, very often what they'll end up appealing to, in fact, almost always what they'll end up appealing to, is various historical examples of particular Christians or nominal Christians who did terrible things. And obviously that's not controversial, of course, that Christians or nominal Christians have done terrible things. I think it's important, though, to distinguish that from Christianity bringing those things, right? People are complex, and though obviously, someone might hold religious beliefs, there's got to be a separate question of, are those religious beliefs responsible for causing or contributing to the person's actions? Because sometimes you'll see a real tension there, right? People often act inconsistently with their stated religious beliefs. So I don't think you can just assume that like Christian did a bad thing, therefore their Christianity is responsible for it. And quite often people aren't careful there.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we're going to take some questions soon if anyone wants to put questions into the chat, but let's talk maybe about this big nub. So we're talking about the fifth myth that we're debunking when it comes to the Crusades, the idea that the Crusades were fundamentally unchristian. There is, I think, a pretty strong reaction, the idea that violence itself is inherently contradictory with the teachings of Jesus, the one who in the Sermon on the Mount teaches us to turn the other cheek whenever we're struck on one, the one who more willingly lay his life down without violently responding, sending legions of angels to his defense at Calvary, the one who told the Apostle Peter when he lashed out in the Garden of Gethsemane to cut off the ear of Malchus the high priest, to put down your sword, for he who lives by the sword will die by the sword. And so there seems to be this strong, almost pacifistic ethic within the New Testament when it comes to how you carry your Christian witness. And that was certainly something you see represented in the early church as well, a reasonably strong commitment to pacifism. But there is this other tradition that develops around sort of just war theory. And one of the key proponents and developers of that theory is Augustine of Hippo, sort of the 5th century bishop in North Africa. What's your response when someone says the Crusades are fundamentally unchristian, that there's no way that Christians would participate in what we see play out, where the Crusaders travel from Europe to the Middle East to be able to pick up a sword and try and violently liberate the kind of Holy Land? What's your take on that?
Yeah, so as I indicated before, my preference, of course, would not be to couch these sorts of wars in the name of Christ, because going back to the point that you made, right, Christ does not give us teaching about those sorts of things, right? Christ never tells us to engage in warfare to spread his name, right? So I'm okay with a Western backlash against Islam or something like that. I would prefer it was not done in the name of God, but obviously I realized pragmatically that was the easiest catalyst that was going to be able to unite the West to go to war against Islam. So I understand why it happened that way. I would prefer, of course, that it had not. But the question then is there something incompatible about going to war, whether in the name of God or not? Is that itself something that is incongruent with Christian teaching, right? So you have this kind of tension, right, in the Bible between the Old and New Testament, right? And so you mentioned these texts about Jesus where it seems, to turn the other cheek. Some people have interpreted it pacifistically, but at the same time, you have Jesus giving pretty resounding endorsements of the Old Testament. And I mean, the Old Testament, you have very clear statements of God, not just allowing, but actually commanding, right, the Israelites to go to war at times. So you have to how do we reconcile these two things together? Obviously, with respect to just more general violent passages in the Old Testament, I believe you are a fan, of course, of William Webb's work here. But I don't know that he applies that specifically to the question of, is warfare itself, right, completely unjustified?
Sure.
And this is something that is interesting, because Jesus's teachings on this stuff, as I read them, right, he's talking about you as a person, right, and your sort of interpersonal interactions with other people. What Jesus doesn't really address is how is it that a nation is supposed to respond, right? Is a nation allowed to use military force to defend itself? The New Testament authors, right, like Paul, for example, tells us that the powers that be, right, they're ordained of God, right? They're supposed to be a scourge against the evildoers. But there's never really any expectation in there that these powers themselves are ever going to adopt Christianity, right? There's this idea that we're supposed to submit to them. We're supposed to recognize that they have God's authority. So the church does have to, once Constantine makes Christianity the religion of the Roman Empire, there is then this question of how do you sort of, obviously, a nation has to be able to defend itself, right? If it just rolls over on its belly and lets every aggressor run over it, it's going to stop existing as a nation. So what are you supposed to do there? I do believe that St. Augustine had essentially the right answer here in just war theory, which, to put it in the simplest possible terms, just war theory, it's supposed to be a last resort, right? You're supposed to have examined all peaceful options before going to war.
Exhausted diplomatic strategies.
Yep. It's not supposed to be taken on for gain. It's supposed to ultimately have peace as its goal. It's supposed to have a proper authority, and it's supposed to have a just cause. Those are essentially the conditions for a just war. Now, of course, we can have debates over the merits of that, right? But if we take that for granted for a moment, that there is such a thing as a just war that looks something like Augustine's theory, the Crusades seem to be a clear example of this. They seem to meet every condition. And so generally my defense of the Crusades proceeds along those lines. If somebody's not on board with just war theory in the first place, right, they just don't think there's any such thing as a just war, that's fine. We can get into an ethical debate over, what is the proper relationship there. What I would say there as it relates to the Crusades is, at that point, you're not giving a specific objection to the ethics of the Crusades, right? You're just giving an objection to warfare in general. You're saying, no war, we should not have actually prevented Adolf Hitler from killing
and
Jews.
I think that's actually a really helpful comparison, is where you're trying to prosecute out the objection, is saying, you'll often hear, hey, well, if we didn't intervene, and usually if the US didn't intervene, let's say in World War II, or if they didn't get kicked into the fight by the bombing of Pearl Harbor, sort of the kicking of the hornet's nest, then people in the UK today would be speaking German, right? You're going to have the end result of that philosophy then having ruling power in other parts of the world, because it wouldn't have been stopped, wouldn't have been restrained upon that sort of spreading evil. The same would be true in this scenario, as best as we can map it out. Right? If the Islamic armies, the different groups that made up the Ummah at the time, were allowed to continue to expand violently into otherwise Christian lands, effectively Islam would have continued to take over, and we wouldn't have the shift, culturally speaking, of Western civilization that we have now today, with all of the fruits that people tend to enjoy. And so I think it's very kind of interesting of just trying to map out, okay, if I don't think that's the right move, do I think that I'm okay with the consequences of evil spreading in that way? Is it possible that just war is a lesser of two evils, or the best possible good given a fallen situation?
Yeah, and those are obviously tough questions, and obviously good Christian people come down on various sides of that. I think just war theory is, it's perfectly defensible theory. I think it's very hard to make sense of the Old Testament and give it any sort of divine authority, as Jesus seems to give it, without adopting something like just war theory. And then, of course, there are the sort of pragmatic considerations, of course, right? Like, you really think we should have done nothing in World War II? You know, really? Yeah, so kind of given that there is such a thing as a just war, my argument for the Crusades essentially tries to then show that the Crusades are a paradigm example of that.
Some scholars have tried to reflect back on God's use of Israel in the judgment upon the cities or peoples of Canaan as an example that human beings don't have the capacity to exercise the right of judgment over good and evil, in that you see their failure to rightly prosecute that judgment and all of the fallout as a result of that. Whether it's with some keeping plunder that they shouldn't have kept, whether it's with them not completing the exile of the Canaanite people groups all the way to the borders that they were intended to. And so then you've got intermarrying and the kind of spiritual corruption that passes down there. That the whole point of the storyline in the Old Testament is to show humans aren't good at being the sword of divine justice. And that's why God uses natural disaster with the flood or with Sodom and Gomorrah, but then has this one example where he uses the people of Israel in this way to show that they do not know how to bear the sword in the kind of godly way that is necessary to prosecute right judgment, and that we just don't have the moral maturity or wisdom yet to be able to do that. I've always found that kind of an interesting argument, in that this is a case study of God saying, hey, I know you guys want to have the knowledge of good and evil, or judge good and evil, to the right of judgment over it, but you don't necessarily have the moral wisdom, genius, or maturity to be able to do that out. I sort of wonder whether or not the Crusades are another example of that. It's like almost a necessary thing, but where you do see examples of very fallen human behavior, it's just we are not good at passing judgment or dealing with evil in the same way that God has the resources to do that rightly. And so every time where humans step in to try and deal with evil, it always just has so much more mess tied up with it than when God will return to set everything right. What's your kind of thoughts around that?
I think there's something to that. I don't think that the correct lesson to draw is pacifism.
Don't do anything. Yeah.
Because again, we have Paul, very clearly saying that God uses the powers that be for these and remember, who is Paul talking about there, right? I mean, he's talking about
he's speaking to the church in Rome about the governing authorities, which is
right?
Literally the
We're talking about Nero,
Rome.
the guy who ultimately had Paul killed, right? We're talking about this guy, the guy who unleashed the first major persecution of Christians. Granted, maybe he hadn't quite done that at the time of Paul writing the letter, but we're certainly dealing with a hostile government at this point in time. And yet Paul still regards the government as being imbibed with the divine authority to, sort of bear the sword in that way. So that would be one reason why I don't think pacifism follows from that consideration. But I do agree, obviously, human beings were always going to be flawed, inadequate. In some ways, I'm glad that's why we have a not perfect, but a more careful system nowadays about those sorts of things, because obviously historical precedent does show us that we need to be very careful about this sort of thing, because we are very limited and imperfect in making those sorts of judgments.
Yeah. When someone then, let's maybe give a bit of a summary on this one. So someone brings up the idea, hey, the Crusades are thoroughly unchristian. I want to start with two different examples of who this might be. Let's start with maybe a Western liberal secular mindset. They come and say, hey, I can't believe in Christianity because look at the Crusades. How do you respond when someone brings that up from maybe that worldview?
So I think the first thing I'm going to point out is the basic logical point, right? That there's not actually any connection there between the truth of the Christianity and that some wars, we can just grant for the sake of argument that these are horrible, right? We can grant every last myth about the Crusades, and nothing about that is going to actually have any bearing on the truth of Christianity, right? At best, or worst case scenario, we just say that's just complete aberration from Christian teaching. But look, Christianity itself can still be true, even if I grant you that. So that, I think, is the first point I would make. The second point I would make would probably be, I'd probably ask them, tell me a little bit about what you think that, went on the Crusades, and maybe in sort of a dialectical form, go through some of the points I've raised here it's probably going to be very likely that they're operating on some misunderstandings. If they, assuming they don't, let's say that they actually do have a pretty strong understanding of the history involved, but they still just, the fact that wars were committed, in the name of Christianity, that, means it's dangerous or something like that. I think that could be then when we sort of get into questions of just war theory, right? Perhaps the person just doesn't think there's any such thing as a just war, and we can get into the philosophical matrix of all that. The most important point, of course, is going to be that there's just no logical connection between the Crusades, even if they're as bad as somebody thinks, and the truth of Christianity. So it need not be a roadblock to that person believing Christianity.
Let's maybe switch hats then and say you're speaking with someone who's a Muslim and they bring up pretty much the same objection. I can't believe in Christianity because of how Christians treated Muslims or because of the Crusades and the atrocities that took place there. How would you answer?
Yeah, and I think it can be probably somebody like that. It's going to be a good idea to try to be sympathetic because they probably are operating on a sort of propaganda that they have heard about it. I think it can still be helpful, of course, to make that basic logical point. But again, a similar point I would raise is, maybe just get into the history of it a little bit, and presumably, right, like the Muslim believes that it's okay to engage in holy war with other religions. What is going to be the principled reason to say that Christianity can't similarly engage in holy war, right? And of course, if the question is, look, Crusaders did bad things to Muslims. I hate to break it to you, but the Muslims weren't exactly the most kind and caring people towards the Crusaders either, right? So if that's a reason to disbelieve in Christianity, and of course I don't think that it is, that's also going to be a reason to disbelieve in Islam, right? So if you say atrocities committed by one religion mean that it can't be true, you're probably going to be able to find examples of that in just about every religion. And of course, that serves to underscore the main point that, again, there's just not a logical connection between these sorts of historical events and the truth of religious doctrines.
Yeah, I think it's going to be interesting in the cultural climate what we're in, where I think Islam is just being discussed a lot more all of a sudden because of a larger number of politicians and local council members throughout places like the UK, which has been historically Christian for well over a millennia, but now are being appointed as very open Muslims who have a longing to see much of the UK come under the influence of Islam. You're starting to see Sharia law instantiated in big parts of the UK, and local governments largely taking hands off, and how a lot of that's prosecuted in certain counties. And just in the US, you've got the appointment recently of the New York mayor who openly is Islamic and has traveled to a mosque to be able to celebrate, and sort of the language of, hey, we're hoping to see Islam through the imams within New York mosques in the 5 boroughs, Islam into every house in sort of the near future. And people are just beginning to wrestle with what's going on here. Is this a conversionist mentality, an evangelistic one, or is this an imperialist mentality? They're wrestling with these sorts of things. So I think this is going to keep coming up, the Crusades conversation and the history of conflict and the West versus Islam. Are they compatible or not? And this how this plays out. I'm curious to see, though, from your research over the years, are there any accounts, eyewitness testimony, key figures that you found surprising and maybe encouraging to read about?
It's a little bit hard to answer that question because there's certainly ones that have been interesting to read about, and you get little pockets of things that are encouraging to read. Going with the first-hand accounts, yeah, this might be an underwhelming answer, but off the top of my head, nothing is coming to mind that I would say I found particularly encouraging. Some of that could just be because of the type of literature it is. But yeah, sorry if that's a bit of a
No,
downer
that's
answer.
totally fine. It's interesting because you've got obviously a dozen or so sources from that period of time, and you are trying to find out they're moving accounts of Christian faith where you're like, oh, that's great, they get it. There's something beautiful in how they're prosecuting out their following of Jesus. But
maybe there's one interesting one I could point out that had a little bit of it was encouraging because it showed a little bit of mutual respect between the two parties there. It was from one eyewitness from the Battle of Dorylaeum, which was kind of sort of the first major battle of the First Crusade. And the Muslims had ambushed the Crusaders, right, and almost had gotten them, but reinforcements came in time and kind of saved their bacon. But writing about the Muslim warriors, one of the Crusaders was, acknowledging that they'd almost gotten the best of them. And I'm trying to recall his exact words. He said something like, had they but been Christians, they would have been our equal. So that was kind of an interesting point of mutual respect.
Respect that's earned there.
Yeah, it just kind of came to mind. I guess you could see encouraging moments like that where you can find times of mutual respect. It wasn't always demonization of the other side, though there's plenty of that as well.
And I think the question everyone really wants to know is, how historically accurate is the Orlando Bloom movie, The Kingdom of Heaven? When you watch that, does it transplant you right back into history, or is this Hollywood doing its thing?
Okay, so Kingdom of Heaven it's actually my second favorite movie. After
great soundtrack. If we could just say great soundtrack.
Yeah, Harry Gregson Williams knows what he's doing. Excellent score. So the answer is going to have to be no, right? It's not terribly historically accurate, right? Balian of Ibelin, he was a real character, but he wasn't the bastard son of Godfrey, right? His father's name wasn't even Godfrey. His father's name was Barristan of Ibelin. He was born in the Holy Land. He, lived there. He was certainly not having relations with the Queen of Jerusalem. Saladin, I think, is portrayed a bit more sympathetically than perhaps he really should be. There are respects in which it is, right? A lot of the heraldry, like, for example, the heraldry of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, that's very historically accurate. A lot of some of the weapons and armor are historically accurate. Some of them are not. Same thing with the castle design. So there's a lot more of an effort to be historically accurate in some parts of Kingdom of Heaven. The biggest historical inaccuracies, outside of just obvious stuff like Balian of Ibelin was not the bastard son of a lord who had to travel to the Holy Land, but outside of that kind of stuff, I think it's going to be sort of the almost like postmodern ideology that's in there. Like Baldwin, the Leper King, was not this sort of postmodernist, peace-loving guy. He was someone who, was happy to take the fight to the Muslims. So it's a film I'm conflicted on. There's things I really like. As a piece of cinema, it's fantastic. The director's cut, as I said, my second favorite film of all time. As a piece of history, sorry, I probably can't give it a passing grade there.
I agree. I think it's great cinema in terms of cinema, but yeah, historically. Just thinking about then, if we could just maybe round table this whole thing, come back to the beginning. When someone raises the Crusades, do you think this in any way is a problem for a Christian? And if it is a problem, why is it a problem? Like, how should we think about it being a challenge to us individually?
Yeah, I certainly don't think it's a problem for the truth of Christianity in any way. So if it's, being used, and it's not usually used as an objection to that. It's more often used as an argument that Christianity is in some way harmful, or, as I said, as part of sort of a broader attack on the West. So I think a proper understanding of the Crusades here can help us to rebut both of those things, both because I don't think that the Crusades were particularly harmful as a whole. I mean, there certainly are episodes here and there, and you've done a good job at pressing me on some of the, tougher aspects there. There are darker chapters there, but on the whole, I do think it was actually a good thing that, Western culture preserved itself and was not overrun by Islamic imperialism. And this established trade between the East and the West. This indirectly led to things like the Renaissance and the Reformation and the Age of Exploration, which ultimately led to America, sorry, you're an Australian, so maybe that doesn't mean quite as much to you as it does to me. But point being, I think a lot of good things directly.
If we didn't have America, we would be lacking a lot of our global entertainment.
Fair enough. Yeah, you wouldn't.
And
Have
I mean that at various levels.
that is a very fair point. But yeah, suffice to say, I don't think that the Crusades on the whole were a bad thing. And as far as the religious violence point, I have just found it helpful to point out that I think something like the Crusades was coming with or without Christianity, simply because some type of Western response was coming to Islamic expansion. And that's, kind of going back to the very first point that we raised of this not being a, unprovoked invasion of these peaceful Islamic lands.
Yeah. The only Crusader castle that I've had the chance of being in overall is in Ephesus, just outside where the temple to Artemis lies in ruins, sort of in the base of this marsh now. It's been reclaimed, and it's like a column and a half of this former ancient wonder of the world. But up on the hill behind it, you can see there's a church there that was originally built there, the castle there, by Justinian, I think, or maybe it even goes back to Theodosius beforehand, and Justinian did upgrades or something. But it lay in ruins when the Crusaders came there in the sort of 12th century. And they rebuilt it. And this is the traditional site where John the Apostle is buried. So the one who receives the revelation, they've still got the supposed tomb there built into the church. And there's a big baptismal pool right next to it, which is just really interesting sort of history. You go there and there's still the remnants of this period of history there throughout the Middle East that's sort of laden across the place. And that's obviously in Ephesus in Turkey. So if anyone wants to go and visit a very interesting historical site, the supposed burial of John the Apostle and a Crusader church that sits on top of it. You can go and check that out there. Mate, just maybe as a closing message to people who are watching this, when we do history, it's messy. And often I feel like we're exposing more and more of those narratives that have framed the way we understand the past that have been politically and religiously motivated that aren't necessarily the truth. And it's just helpful to begin to unpick some of this overlay to find out what are the myths, what's the truth, to get a real sense of what happened, and then sort of grapple with, like, this is messy as part of history. But where do you find God in the middle of that? And I just appreciate you bringing out, look, you do think there's been a real war for ideas. The kind of Western civilization that had inherited much of the legacy of the Christian story, and then the expansion of the Islamic Empire over those early centuries, and just the opportunity for that expansion to be halted and to hold back that tide and to preserve some of the real goods of Western civilization that now we enjoy the fruits of today. It's just helpful to keep all of that in memory. This is a dark chapter of history, but there is still some goods that sort of come out to it as well. So just appreciate your insights there. Any parting message you'd like to leave with everyone who's watching?
Yeah, well, so I just say history in general, I think, is something that unfortunately a lot of modern education has it's failed to impart to people. Stuff that we would have just taken for granted. I think a new study came out showing that like 80% of like the next generation doesn't know what the Reformation is and stuff like that. Stuff that you should just assume that people would know what the Protestant Reformation was, because like how do you understand the trajectory of history without that, right? So history is fascinating, and it's not just interesting, it's kind of the story of how we got to where we are, and we can understand things, right? As much as I've denied that the Crusades are the direct cause of conflicts in the Middle East today, history is broadly the explanation for why we're here. And people often say, right, that we can learn from the past, right, so as not to repeat the mistakes of it. So I just find history incredibly valuable. And so, don't be too quick to assume that popular narratives are correct, especially when they are ones that are being used for ideological purposes. Quite often the stuff will be, and by the way, I probably sounded like a Christian apologist on this program today, which I am, right? But what I've been saying is actually this is the mainstream position in the Crusades scholarship, what I've been presenting here. This is not like the Christian apologetics spin on the history of the Crusades. This is the mainstream position. So yeah, just don't be too quick to swallow the narratives, essentially. And if you take an interest in these sorts of things, if you just like good stories, I think the era of the Crusades will provide a lot of those for you. So definitely worth studying.
And one thing I found really helpful personally too, when people bring up certain Christian atrocities, whether done by individuals, and you can think about all the recent history of Christians gone wild and Christian leaders who have been exposed as having a very dark double life. I think I'm doing a live stream just in a couple of days with a friend of mine, one of my closest mates in the world, but a former colleague too. We both worked in RZAM sort of 5 years ago. We're 5 years on now since all of that came out in the aftermath of Ravi's death, just to reflect back on your experience of that. And whenever you see that or these historical atrocities where Christians supposedly perpetrate evil, I always just find it so helpful to have the example of Jesus. And mostly what our concern is that people have this dark shadow side. And it was the closest friends and followers and even enemies of Jesus, when looking at his life, could find no darkness in him at all, that speak about him as the light of the world and the great hope, the human who was so radically different to all of us, who are a mixed bag of good and evil, of light and darkness, and yet he was just so pure in who he revealed heaven to be to us, the invisible God made visible. So I always find it helpful when people say, well, look at the bad things Christians do. I'm like, yeah, there's a reason why human beings need salvation, because we put our foot in it all the time. And that you have this incredible example in Jesus, a perfect life that's offered in our place. There's something beautiful about the hope in him and his life standing as the very thing which condemns unchristian behavior. Is just something to really helpful to lean back into.
And I think that's one of you raise an important point that it kind of makes history more satisfying from the perspective of faith, because I would still love history, in particular, like medieval military history, if I were an atheist, right? I would still find it fascinating. But there would be this deep lack of satisfaction, right? That all of the injustices and wrongdoings are in some sense, like they're never going to be rectified. From an atheist point of view. As a believer, I do have that sense of satisfaction, and that this is all part of a story, and I know the ending, and so I do know that the wrongs will be made right, ultimately by the person of Jesus. So I do think that is a helpful bookend to the sort of end of the discussion there.
Totally. Well, mate, thanks for jumping on. We'll make sure that your own YouTube channel, Faith Because of Reason, is down there in the link so people can see that. Got a great series of videos that are coming out on this in the future. I'm sure it's going to be fantastic, because your previous scholarship has always been so helpful for people to dive into complex topics. He's got tons of videos covering everything from the resurrection to the ontological argument to whether or not idealism is true. This and other great controversies you can find over at Faith Because of Reason. So go and check out those videos. David does a great job over there. Mate, thanks for joining. And until we see everyone next time, truth invites questioning. We'll see you later.